This is Kate Shields, and this is my museum biography on the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. The museum hours are open from 10 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. every day except Thursday. On Thursdays, they keep the museum open later to facilitate events using their space, such as Young Professionals Networking Nights, guest speakers, hands-on activities for children, and historical reenactors. The cost is $25 for adults, and this includes one floor of the museum. Essentially, every tour is a different floor. So it's $25 for adults and $22 for members per floor. They also have food and walking tours of the neighborhood that surrounds the museum, and these are a little more expensive, but include a tour of one floor of the museum of the visitor's choice, as well as the walking tour. There are various staff involved in running the museum, including the main staff, such as president, vice president, COO, and directors of each department. There are also visitor services assistants, sales assistants, and tour guides that work in the main visitor services gift shop and the visitor services center. 97 Orchard Street was built in 1863. It is located on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and it used to be a tenement building for actual immigrants that were new to New York City. And from 1863 to the early 20th century, real immigrant families lived in the building, and there were about 15,000 residents that lived there throughout the course of the building's history. The Tenement Museum was founded in 1988 by Anita Jacobson and Ruth Abram. Ruth Abram wanted to document the lives of all of immigrants who came to New York City and who lived in tenements and tell their story and their experience. They weren't sure how to do it, and they almost had given up on finding a good space to tell this story when they came upon 97 Orchard Street in 1988 and saw that it had basically been preserved from the day it was closed in 1935 and all the residents were evicted. In 1988, they started to discover everything inside the building. They started researching about the immigrants that used to live there and started putting together the stories of the families that used to live in the tenement. In Learning Local Immigration History in and Out of the Museum by Jeremy Stoddard, Alan Marcus, Kurt Squire, and John Martin, they describe the Tenement Museum as saying, of course, while the family names and stories at 97 Orchard are based on the historical record, much of the exhibition reflects the general material culture, possessions, and experiences of the ethnic groups they represent and their experiences in New York during the time being portrayed. Given the tight space visitors wander through, the tour itself provides an aspect of an augmented reality experience of the cramped tenement quarters. So it provides visitors with an experience unlike most other museums, where they get to experience the physical aspects of living in. Again, they were only able to preserve about 1,500 residents' stories or discover their stories that were preserved through the building out of the 7,000 or so people that had lived in the building. So they really are representing through the 1,500 resident stories and through the stories of the 4 floors. They're really representing every family that lived there, even though they don't have documented evidence of every single person that lived in the building. In a New York Times article by William Grimes, they describe a story of a resident, Rita Acione, who returned to the site where she used to live at 97 Orchard Street. She left when she was only 9 years old, and she returned to the building that she spent time in as a child and got to see how it was turned into a museum and see how her family's experience was preserved through the efforts of the museum staff. And she described what the neighborhood was like. She talked about various activities that her family used to do in the building. They used to sleep on the roof on hot days, sharing the hallway toilets with her neighbors and things like that. And she has very fond memories of the building. And these are the kinds of things that the museum tries to preserve and exhibit to visitors through audio, historical interviews, through artifacts recreated or real, through documents, and these are the kind of things that really can put the visitors back into the time that the residents lived there. Of course, house museums, such as the Tenement Museum, face unique issues and obstacles that other museums do not. For example, upkeep and renovations. These buildings have been around for decades, sometimes centuries, and were not designed for the volume of visitor traffic that they experience. And so the staff has to deal with old buildings, stairs that might not be safe, and things like that that can handle increased visitor traffic that other museums don't have to contend with because they were built to be a museum and handle that amount of visitor traffic. There's also the issue of small space and lack of classroom space. And so for funding, especially if they were able to hold large events or other things in their space, they could charge money for that and kind of, make revenue through that. But the Tenement Museum especially doesn't have the space for events like that. And in the future, they might be acquiring other buildings in the area. But for now, it's hard for them to include that as another revenue source because they just don't have the space. And finally, technology. They don't have the infrastructure to incorporate a lot of technology, and while they have in their exhibits, and for example, in the visitor center, they have a video playing and things like that, the building wasn't designed to incorporate the 21st century technology that could enhance some of the exhibits, and so that's another issue that they have to contend with. Stephanie Meeks said in 2002, the average house museum incurred a cost of $40 per visitor, but only took in $8 per visitor. That is the definition of unsustainable, and no amount of creativity in the gift shop is likely to bridge that gap. There are solutions, a few, such as merger and asset transfer, reorganization of the board or the staff, reuse of the house into something like a community and arts center, and also just sale of the house to a nonprofit or a private owner. Susan Orr said in Historic House Museum Sustainability in the 21st Century, Path to Preservation, that there are, of course, issues to each of these solutions, such as increased need for time, extra funds needed to acquire legal counsel or go through the process of selling or repurposing the house, different goals or views within the new staff or board if they decide to reorganize. They might not have the same goals for the museum, and also different views from the community on what the house should be used for, especially something that has significant ties to the community's history. The educational staff at the Tenement Museum also wants to promote 21st century learning for the children that come through. This includes inquiry-based learning, technology, hands-on activities, collaboration, and activities that promote critical thinking. Many museums today are concerned with this, but the Tenement Museum especially does not want students to see the museum as outdated because of their lack of technology, and so they're really trying to incorporate hands-on activities and other activities that promote collaboration and critical thinking with their students in order to prepare them for 21st century education. Maria Zanthudaki said, making and or tinkering activities are by now a well-established activity in many museums and other settings. The two share many common elements, i.e. the hands-on relationship with objects and technology, a strong underlying scientific dimension, a creative dimension, the centrality of the individual in the whole process, but in my view are quite distinct when used as learning methodologies. And all of these things, such as making, tinkering, hands-on activities, prepare students to work as a team, to critically think about the end result, and promote inquiry-based learning. And so this is something that the Tenement Museum, as well as other museums, are trying to incorporate into their educational activities. When I went to the Tenement Museum, I noticed that it was a very small museum. First off, the visitor center and gift shop are combined, and they create a very small space that is confusing at first. It has a confusing layout, but it's somewhat organized with the gift shop on one side and the visitor center on the other side, kind of tucked away in a corner, which as a visitor, it was hard to stand there and decide which tour to do without feeling like I was in the way of people wanting to buy things from the gift shop. So these two spaces could be expanded if possible. The thing that I noticed also was that people with physical disabilities would not be accommodated in certain tours because the building has no elevator because it's so old. And while there are elevators in the visitor center, there are no elevators in the museum itself, and so these guests would have to stick to the ground floor, which is somewhat limiting. Children are allowed, not in large groups because of the space constraints, but there was a school group on the day that I went, and I noticed that they were allowed. The guide was very knowledgeable. It was a very collaborative environment. The tour group was encouraged to talk to each other and introduce ourselves and talk about our history and if we had any immigrant stories or came from another place. The technology was incorporated well. We took objects and we placed them on a table, and once we placed them on the table, the technology would recognize the object and then tell stories through videos, audio, text that went with the object. So, for example, a brick. I placed the brick on the table, and it talked about the night that a brick was thrown through the shop at 97 Orchard Street because of racism towards the family that owned the shop. And so that was just a very interesting experience and use of technology. There could be a separate information desk or kiosk for visitors. Thankfully, I looked at the museum website before I visited, and so I was able to ascertain what it was about and how the different tours worked and what the different floors were, but it would be very helpful for other people just going to the visitor center or stumbling into the shop to have a different kiosk that explained all of these things, because the signage is it's near the ceiling and it's kind of near the register, and it doesn't feel like a space where visitors can spend time deciding which tour they want to take. Overall, though, it was a positive experience, and I would recommend it to anyone. My interview was with Katie Baker Barracks, the Visitor Services Director at the Tenement Museum. She emphasized over and over and over again that networking is key. To do volunteering, to do internships, to get involved in any way I can in grad school or otherwise, and that this is a huge part of the museum culture. And it's all about who you know and about timing, and it's definitely good to meet people. Her pros of the job: she really enjoyed meeting a variety of people every day. She gets to hear their personal stories, such as if they had immigrant families in the Lower East Side in their family history, or if they were immigrants themselves. She did say that there were different challenges that arose every day, so that kept her on her toes. A con of the job: she said it was a very small staff of the Tenement Museum, and so her role was roughly and loosely defined, and that she chipped in doing various jobs and tasks and helping various departments throughout the day. So it was hard to plan her schedule, but it also kept things interesting. She said that we have the potential to change the perspective of museums in the future and a chance to be progressive with technology, but that we must be mindful and to be creative about how we use the technology and about different funding sources and visitor marketing. And that coming up in the future, we can't overuse technology, and she said that she thinks that there's a possibility of that, and so we have to be mindful about how we use those things. Her favorite museums in New York, other than the Tenement Museum, of course, are the Met and the Museum of the Moving Image. She said she liked the Met because it's contemplative and calming and just a classic art museum. She said the Museum of the Moving Image is where she goes for stimulation, it's interactive, she takes visitors there, and it's just a fun environment. And those are two examples of very different types of museums that she really enjoys going to. Overall, I enjoyed my interview with Katie. She was very knowledgeable, very enthusiastic about the Tenement Museum and the museum field in general. And she said that the biggest thing she could tell me as someone entering the field was to do as much research as I can and to network and just meet as many different people in the field as possible.